Staff Sergeant Maddox didn't even look up when Riley Voss walked onto the range. He just laughed, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Command actually sent us a girl," he said, tossing her registration folder back onto the table without reading it. "What's next, sending the janitor?" The other men chuckled. Riley said nothing. She picked up the folder, tucked it under her arm, and walked to the end of the line. Nobody knew it yet. But that laugh was the beginning of the most humiliating day of Maddox's career. Before we go any further, if stories like this move you, hit subscribe and follow Riley's journey all the way to the end. And drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The roster said 13 names. 12 of those names had been earned in places most people only saw in documentaries. Fallujah, Kandahar, Mosul, the Korangal Valley. These were men who had made shots in wind and rain, in the kind of darkness where your own hands disappear in front of your face. They had pulled triggers in moments where missing didn't mean embarrassment. It meant a body bag. It meant a brother didn't come home. These were not men who bragged without reason. They bragged because they had reason. And the reason was written in commendations and confirmed kills, in the quiet nods of commanders who didn't give quiet nods to just anybody. The 13th name on that roster was Petty Officer Riley Voss. Nobody knew her, and in a world where reputation was currency, being unknown was the same as being broke. The training ground outside Yuma, Arizona was the kind of place that didn't apologize for itself. The sun came down like a punishment. The ground cracked and pale. The air shimmered in ways that made the horizon look like it was breathing, which in this context wasn't a poetic observation, it was a tactical problem. Mirage, heat distortion, the invisible enemy of any long-range shooter, because what your eye sees and what the bullet actually travels through are two entirely different realities when the temperature hits 108 degrees and the air between you and your target is cooking like the inside of an oven. 3,680. That was the distance to the target. To put that in terms that land differently, that's more than 2 miles. That's the length of 36 football fields laid end to end. That's far enough that by the time a bullet traveling at roughly 3,000 feet per second finally reaches the steel plate, it has been in the air for over 8 seconds. 8 seconds during which the wind can shift. The temperature gradient can change. The Earth itself, slowly rotating, will have nudged the bullet's path by several inches due to nothing more than physics and planetary mechanics. The Coriolis effect, the same force that shapes hurricanes, is not a theoretical concern at that distance. It is a real, measurable, calculable drift that must be factored in before the trigger is ever touched. 3,600 meters. Nobody had ever done it under these conditions. Not officially, not documented. The record books had gaps at that distance, the way a boxer's face has gaps after a long career, and for similar reasons. It had been tried, and trying had not been enough. Staff Sergeant Dominic Maddox was the kind of man who filled a room before he entered it. You heard him first. His voice was built for command, for projection, for the kind of certainty that makes younger soldiers stand straighter without being told to. He was 41 years old, and he looked like someone had carved him out of something durable. Jaw-tight eyes, pale and sharp. The kind of face that processed information quickly and had very little patience for input it considered irrelevant. He had 17 confirmed long-range kills. He had trained snipers in 3 countries. He had been written about in 2 military publications and had declined the opportunity to be written about in a 3rd because, as he put it, the journalist didn't understand what he was looking at. He was by any reasonable measure an exceptional soldier. He was also by any reasonable measure a man who had stopped being curious about the things he thought he already understood. When Riley Voss arrived at the Yuma Range that morning, Maddox was already there. He was reviewing wind readings with Gunnery Sergeant Leon Chen, a stocky, focused man who had been shooting competitively since before he enlisted and who approached the physics of long-range marksmanship the way an engineer approaches a bridge, methodically, respectfully, and with a deep appreciation for the consequences of being wrong. "Wind is going to be inconsistent," Chen said, looking at the data on his tablet. "Variable gusts between 8 and 14 knots below 500 meters. Above that, we're reading a crosswind layer that's running almost perpendicular to the shot line. This is going to be ugly." Maddox didn't respond immediately. He was looking out toward the target, a steel plate, roughly the size of a car door 2 miles away, small enough at this distance to be invisible to the naked eye. You needed optics just to confirm it was there. Everything ugly eventually straightens out, Maddox said, which was the kind of thing he said when he didn't want to acknowledge that something was genuinely complicated. That was when the sound of boots on dry ground turned both men around. Riley Voss came onto the range carrying a hard case and a backpack. She was medium height, lean in the way that suggested function rather than aesthetics. Her hair was pulled back tightly. She wore no rank insignia on her range gear, which was standard, but it also meant there was nothing on her exterior to signal that she belonged there except the authorization papers in her folder. Her eyes moved the way eyes move when they're always gathering information, quick, deliberate, taking in the range of the position of the sun, the way the mirage was already rising off the ground at mid-morning. She was reading the environment before she said a single word to anyone. Maddox watched her check in at the administrative table. He watched the range officer, a young corporal named Tate, look down at the roster and then up at Riley with a flicker of surprise that he tried unsuccessfully to suppress. Petty Officer Voss, Tate said, slightly uncertain, as if confirming the name would somehow resolve the apparent confusion. That's right, Riley said, calm, not defensive, just factual. Tate pointed her toward the shooter's position assignment board. Maddox walked over before Riley had taken 3 steps away from the table. Hold on, he said, not to Tate, to Riley directly. She stopped and turned, looked at him without particular urgency. Maddox, he said, extending neither his hand nor any warmth. Staff Sergeant, I'm running this evaluation. I know who you are, Riley said. That surprised him slightly, not that she knew his name, but the flatness with which she said it. No deference, no attempt to manage his ego, which most people did consciously or not simply because his ego was large enough to generate its own gravitational field. You're the Navy name on my roster, he said. I am. This is a joint evaluation technically, he said, and the word technically came out of his mouth, the way a door sounds when someone closes it firmly without quite slamming it. But this group is Army and Marine Corps. The methodology here is, I've reviewed the methodology, Riley said. I've also reviewed the range conditions, the previous attempts at this target, at distance, the atmospheric data from the last 2 weeks, and the ballistic profiles of the rounds we're using today. She paused. I'm ready when you are. Maddox stared at her for a moment. Then he turned back to Chen, who had been watching this exchange with the expression of a man who was choosing very carefully to have no expression at all. Let's get everyone assembled, Maddox said. When the 12 other shooters gathered at the range, the introductions were brief. These were men who introduced themselves through resumes, spoken aloud unit deployment history, confirmed ranges. It was the military equivalent of a poker table where everyone puts their cards face up before the hand is even dealt. Lieutenant James Barnes, Army Rangers, longest confirmed shot at 2,800 meters. Senior Chief Paulson, Navy SEALs 3 Tours ballistic specialist. Gunnery Sergeant Chen, Marine Corps competitive shooting champion, multiple records at distance, and so on. 12 men with 12 sets of credentials that would have impressed anyone in any room in the world. When it came to Riley's turn in the informal rotation of self-identification, she said simply, Petty Officer Voss, Naval Special Warfare. There was a pause. That's it, Barnes said, not cruelly, but with the bluntness of someone who genuinely didn't understand why the list had stopped. That's it, Riley said. Maddox made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. Command said they were adding a specialist. I assumed specialist meant something specific. He looked her over once quickly, the way someone glances at a word they don't recognize, and decides it probably isn't important. You look like a public affairs photo. A few of the men laughed. Sergeant First Class Dyer, big tattooed with a neck that suggested his parents had been professional wrestlers, grinned openly. Riley didn't react, not with anger, not with hurt. She looked at Maddox with the same expression she'd been wearing since she arrived, which was the expression of someone who is processing information they fully expected to receive. Senior Chief Rowland, the most senior man on the range by age, if not by rank, caught Riley's eye for just a moment. He was 62, thin-framed, white-haired, and he had the quality that some men develop after a certain number of years in dangerous work, a stillness that had nothing to do with passivity. He said nothing, but he nodded almost imperceptibly in Riley's direction. Just once. She saw it. Gave nothing back. But she saw it. The briefing came next. Maddox ran it with precision and efficiency, which was genuinely the best version of him. The instructor, the technical expert, the man who had thought hard and long about the physics of what they were attempting. 3,600 meters, he said, standing at the whiteboard that had been set up under a portable canopy. That is not a documented achievable range under field conditions. We are here to find out how close we can get, what adjustments yield the best groupings, and to establish data that can inform future training parameters. He looked around the group. Nobody goes home with a confirmed hit today. That is not the expectation. The expectation is data. He paused. Except Maddox, Dyer muttered to Barnes just loudly enough that half the group heard it, which earned another ripple of quiet laughter. Maddox heard it too and didn't discourage it. That was its own kind of statement. We'll shoot in order of roster, Maddox continued. Observers will log every shot. Wind data will be updated every 90 seconds from the sensor array. You will not shoot without checking current wind. You will not rush. You will take all the time you need to build a correct firing solution, and if your firing solution doesn't account for every variable on this board. He tapped the whiteboard, which listed wind temperature, gradient, mirage intensity, Coriolis barometric pressure, spin drift. Then your firing solution is wrong and your shot will tell you exactly that. He looked at the board. He looked at the group. Any questions? Riley raised her hand, not dramatically, just up clean, waiting. Maddox looked at her with a flatness that was itself a form of condescension. Voss? The temperature gradient data you have here is from 0600, she said. It's now past 09. The layer conditions will have changed. Do we have updated gradient measurements or are we working from projection? Silence. Chen looked up from his tablet. There was something in his eyes that he shut down quickly, a flicker of recognition or maybe recalibration. We're working from projection with sensor updates, Maddox said, and there was the faintest tightening around his jaw. The sensors will give us current data at ground level. Mid-range gradient is modeled. Modeled from this morning's conditions, Riley said. It wasn't a challenge, it was a clarification, but the clarification implied a problem, and everyone in the group understood exactly what that implication was. Yes, Maddox said, modeled from this morning's conditions, which is standard procedure. I know, Riley said. I just want to make sure we're all working from the same baseline assumptions. She lowered her hand. Thank you. The first shooter took position at 0947. By 14:23, all 12 men had fired their shots. None of them had hit the target. Barnes had come closest. His shot clipped the far edge of the steel frame, which wasn't a hit, but was close enough that he spent 40 minutes afterward analyzing exactly what had happened, running calculations on his tablet with a focus that was almost physical in its intensity. Gunnery Sergeant Chen had shot beautifully technically. His wind reading was impeccable. His hole was clean. His patience was the patience of a man who had made peace with time. His shot landed approximately 6 feet to the left of the plate at an estimated 200 meters short of the target. The bullet, after 9 seconds in flight, had drifted on a wind layer that the morning's gradient model had underestimated by nearly 8 knots. Maddox had shot fourth. He'd taken longer than anyone else to build his firing solution, cross-referencing 3 different wind readings, adjusting for temperature, inputting the Coriolis correction for their latitude, and the compass bearing to the target. When he finally fired, there was an expectation in the air, not just from him, but from the group. If anyone was going to do this, the logic went it was Maddox. His round struck the berm approximately 4 feet below and 3 feet right of the target. He didn't say anything afterward. He stood up from the position. He walked to his water bottle. He drank slowly. He didn't look at anyone. Dyer missed by wider. Senior Chief Paulson missed by less. Lieutenant Weller, who specialized in thermal conditions and had written a small study on temperature's effect on long-range ballistics, missed by a margin that contradicted everything he thought he understood about the science. Senior Chief Rawlins shot last among the 12. He set up with the careful deliberateness of someone who has decided that efficiency is more dignified than speed. He lay behind the rifle settled, checked his wind data, and then did something none of the others had done. He waited. 5 minutes, 8 minutes. The range went quiet. Some of the men began to exchange looks that questioned what the old man was doing and whether anyone was going to say something. Maddox started to open his mouth. Rowland fired. The round crossed the 2-mile gap. It hit the berm 6 inches below the bottom edge of the plate. The closest shot of the day. A miss, but a miss that communicated something, that there was a reading being done by that man that was worth paying attention to. Rowland stood up slowly and looked out toward the target for a long moment. Then he turned around and his eyes without hurry found Riley. Interesting conditions, he said to no one in particular. Maddox turned to look at the range officer. Tate had the shot log in his hand. 13 on the roster, Tate said, answering the unasked question. Voss hasn't shot. The range went quiet in a different way. Maddox looked at Riley. She was sitting apart from the group on a folding stool, a small notebook open on her knee. She had been writing in it throughout the day, not looking at her phone, not talking, just watching, writing. Every few minutes, she watched the mirage for a while, then sat back down and wrote something else. You've been taking notes, Maddox said. It came out more accusatory than observational, which told you something about the state he was in. Yes, Riley said. Notes on what conditions, she said. The mirage is reading in cycles, roughly 11-minute intervals where it flattens. I've been tracking the intervals. She glanced at her notebook. Should be another flat window in about 4 minutes. Maddox looked at her the way people look at someone who has just said something in a language they don't speak. The words were comprehensible, but the meaning refused to assemble itself into anything that made immediate sense. The mirage, he said slowly, flattens in cycles. It does here, she said. The terrain to the northwest is channeling air in a pattern. You can see it if you watch long enough. She looked at him. Have you ever spent time near the Sonoran coast? Similar phenomenon happens in certain conditions. When Paman, I know what the Sonoran coast is, Maddox said, and now the edge in his voice had become undisguisable. I'm sure you do, Riley said, and her tone was still even, still without aggression, which somehow made it worse. I just meant that my father used to take me out there when I was young. He pointed out the pattern. It stuck with me. Something about the personal detail landed in an unexpected place. Several of the men shifted their weight slightly. Dyer stopped turning his water bottle in his hands. Your father, Maddox said. He was a precision shooter, Riley said. 40 years ago, different equipment, same physics. Maddox said nothing. Riley stood up from the stool, closed her notebook, and picked up her rifle case. You said roster order. She looked at him steadily. I'm last on the roster. That's right, Maddox said. Then it's my turn, she said. She walked to the shooter's position. She did not look at any of the men as she passed them. She was not performing indifference. She genuinely was not thinking about them in that moment. She was thinking about wind cycles and temperature layers and a father who used to take her to the desert and point at shimmering air and say, watch, Riley, don't look at where you're going. Look at everything between here and there. She set up her rifle. Roland walked to the shade of the canopy and lowered himself into a chair. He watched her with his arms resting on his knees, his head slightly forward, the way a man watches something he suspects he is going to remember. Chen stepped closer to the observation scope quietly, so as not to announce that he was paying more attention than he wanted to appear to be paying. Maddox stood with his arms crossed. Dyer said quietly to Barnes, this should be interesting. And the way he said it made clear he expected it to be interesting in the way a car crash is interesting, briefly and badly. Riley lay down behind the rifle. She put her eye to the scope, and then she did the thing that Roland had done, which made him one of 3 people on this range who was beginning to understand something. She waited. She watched the mirage through her scope. She breathed slowly. She did not grip the rifle with tension. She held it with the kind of relaxed firmness that is only available to people who have made so many shots that the mechanics have sunk below consciousness, the way a concert pianist's finger movement sinks below thought. 3 minutes passed. Maddox shifted his weight. He wanted to say something. He physically wanted to produce sound into this silence, but because the silence was doing something to the dynamic on this range that he did not have a precise word for, but that felt in some way he could not fully articulate, like it was no longer entirely his range. 4 minutes. Then Riley made a single small adjustment to her elevation. She took one long breath, and she fired. The report of the rifle cracked out across the desert, and then the desert swallowed it the way the desert swallows everything quickly and completely. The sound rolled away, and there was the 9-second wait, which at this distance is not a brief pause, but a genuine suspension of time, a gap during which the physics either work or they don't, and no amount of will or hope or credentials can change what's going to happen out there, where the steel plate waited in the hammering sun. Tate was on the observation scope. His posture changed. It was a small change, a slight straightening, a brief arrest of movement, but on a range full of people trained to read small changes, it registered like a shout. Maddox saw it. What? He said. Flat, a statement, not a question. Tate didn't answer immediately. Tate, Maddox said. Hit, Tate said. He pulled back from the scope. He said it again as if confirming it to himself. Center mass, dead center. He looked up. His face had the expression of someone who has seen something they will describe to people for the rest of their lives. She hit it. Nobody moved. Riley was already standing. She was brushing dust from her sleeve. She picked up her notebook and tucked it under her arm. Maddox was staring at the observation scope, as if he could, by looking hard enough at the instrument through which the impossible had been observed, find a technical explanation that restored the world to the shape it had been in 90 seconds ago. Chen walked to the observation scope. He looked for himself. He stood back up. He looked at Riley. That was the flat window, he said quietly. Yes, Riley said. You timed the mirage cycle. Yes. Chen was quiet for a moment. Then slowly he nodded, not in congratulation exactly, in recognition. The nod of a craftsman watching another craftsman do something that reorients the standard. Roland had not moved from his chair. He was looking at Riley with an expression that was close to private, the expression of a man having a thought he hasn't decided to share yet. How did you know the interval was 11 minutes, Roland asked. My father started teaching me to read Mirage when I was 12, Riley said. And I've been watching this one since I arrived this morning. She looked at him. You were waiting for it too, on your shot. Roland didn't deny it. I waited, he said. I miscounted. He paused. By about 45 seconds. The first few cycles are longer, she said. They compress as the sun gets higher. I should have said something earlier. Yes, Roland said simply. You should have. It was the most honest exchange anyone had had on the range all day, and it lasted fewer than 20 seconds, and almost everyone there felt it and could not have said exactly why. Dyer was looking at the ground. Barnes was looking at the observation scope. Several of the other men had the particular stillness of people who were quietly recalculating something. Maddox had not moved. He was still facing the downrange direction, arms crossed the line of his jaw, tight in a way that was readable from 10 meters away, if you were paying attention. He turned eventually. He looked at Riley. He looked at the notebook under her arm. He looked at Tate, who was carefully documenting the confirmed hit in the range log with the kind of deliberate professionalism that was itself a form of self-protection. If I'm very focused on this paperwork, I am not required to navigate what is happening socially in the next few feet. Atmospheric conditions, Maddox said finally. His voice was controlled. Too controlled, which meant it was an effort. You had a window. I did, Riley said. I waited for it. The others could have waited for the same window. They could have, she said. The window was available. It opened twice before I shot, starting around hour 2. She paused. I would have mentioned it, but I wasn't sure if you wanted input from the 13th name on the roster. There was nothing performative about the way she said it. It wasn't a jab, or rather, it was a jab the way a precise cut is walked, surgical enough that the damage was in exactly the right place. Maddox's face did something complicated and then resolved back to controlled. Pack up, he said to the group. We debrief in 30. He walked away from Riley without another word, which was the only response he had available to him that didn't require him to say something he either couldn't or wouldn't say. The group began to break down positions. The conversation that broke out was the quiet, fragmented, low-pitched conversation of men who have something significant to process and are processing it through the mechanics of movement, stowing gear, checking equipment, doing the physical business of leaving a range. Chen fell into step beside Riley as she carried her case back toward the staging area. The temperature gradient question, he said, this morning. You already knew the model was off. I suspected it, she said. Why didn't you say so? Riley considered this for a moment. Because I wasn't sure I'd be heard, and I needed to see the conditions for myself before I could say it with any confidence. Chen was quiet. You were right about the model, he said. I checked my data afterward. The mid-range gradient was running almost double the projection. I know, she said. You can see it in the Mirage behavior. Most people can't read Mirage at that distance. Most people don't try, she said. Not critically, just as an observation. They walked in silence for a moment. Your father, Chen said. The shooter. Yes. Does he know you're here? Riley looked ahead at the staging area at the truck she had driven in from base at the desert that extended in every direction to a horizon that stayed stubbornly flat and distant no matter how far you walked toward it. He died 4 years ago, she said. Chen said nothing. But he knew I'd get here eventually, she said. He was patient like that. She loaded her case into the truck, and the desert went on baking in the Arizona sun, and the steel plate 2 miles away held the mark of a single round dead center that no one on this range would forget. The debrief tent was quiet in the way that places get quiet after something has happened that nobody has fully processed yet. 12 men sat or stood in the narrow shade, water bottles in hand, eyes mostly down or forward, and the silence between them had texture to it, the kind that accumulates when a group of people are all thinking the same thing, but nobody wants to be the first to say it out loud. Riley Voss had hit a steel plate at 3,600 meters. Nobody else had. Maddox stood at the front of the tent with his arms crossed and his jaw set in a line that communicated clearly and without ambiguity that the next 30 minutes were going to be managed carefully and on his terms. He had his tablet, he had his wind data, he had his post-shot analysis prepared. What he did not have, and what he was working hard not to visibly need, was an explanation. Debrief runs as follows, he said, and his voice had the controlled cadence of a man who has decided that volume and pace are the only variables he can control right now, so he will control them absolutely. Each shooter walks through their firing solution, what you calculated, what you observed, what you'd change. No commentary from the group during individual presentations. Questions at the end. He looked around the tent. His eyes moved past Riley like she wasn't there. She was sitting at the far end of the row of folding chairs, her notebook open on her knee, her pen moving slowly. She was still writing, still observing, still doing the thing that seemed to bother certain people in this tent more than the miss itself, the quiet, continuous act of paying attention. Barnes went first. He was thorough and honest the way Rangers tend to be in formal settings. Methodical, no excuses, focused on the gap between what he calculated and what happened. My wind model below 500 meters was accurate, he said. Above that, I was reading a steady 9-knot component and treating it as uniform. It wasn't. There were at least 2 distinct layers running at different angles, and I didn't account for the transition zone between them. He paused. That's where I lost the shot. Maddox nodded, made a note. Next. Chen was next, and Chen being Chen, his debrief was almost clinical. The kind of debrief that should have been delivered in a classroom with a laser pointer. He broke his shot down into segments, terminal, ballistics, atmospheric interaction at each range bracket. Spin, drift accumulation. He had reconstructed the flight path of his round with a level of precision that impressed even the men who were still quietly stinging from their own misses. The gradient model was the primary error, Chen said. He said it without flourish, without accusation, just as a statement of fact. The morning data underestimated the mid-range layer by a significant margin. Running projections from a stale baseline in conditions this dynamic is, he stopped, recalibrated. It's something we should address in the methodology. Maddox looked at him for a long moment. Noted, he said, and moved on. Dyer went next, and Dyer's debrief was shorter and louder and contained the word ridiculous twice in reference to the wind conditions, which told you that Dyer processed frustration by distributing it outward rather than inward. Senior Chief Paulson was precise and brief. Rowland, when his turn came, simply said, I waited for the right window. I miscounted the interval by approximately 40 seconds. I'll know better next time. Then he sat back down. There was a pause after Rowland finished. Maddox looked at the roster on his tablet. He looked up. That covers the 12 primary evaluations, he said. The tent was quiet. Tate, the range officer, who had been sitting near the entrance with the official log on his clipboard, cleared his throat. It was a very small sound, functionally insignificant, except that it happened in a silence where every sound was significant and several heads turned toward him, and Maddox's eyes moved to him with the patient deliberateness of a man who already knows what's coming and has decided to make it come to him on his schedule. The log shows 13 shooters, Tate said carefully. 13 evaluations. Petty Officer Voss. I'm aware of what the log shows, Maddox said. Another silence. Dyer shifted in his chair. Barnes studied the ground. Rowland looked at Maddox. The log shows a confirmed hit, Rowland said. Not loudly, just clearly. It shows an impact under the specific atmospheric conditions that occurred outside the standard evaluation window, Maddox said. Voss shot after the primary evaluation was complete. The conditions at that point were the same conditions the rest of us shot in, Rowland said, plus 4 hours of observation time. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The target doesn't care what time it is. The tent tightened. Maddox looked at Roland with an expression that had several layers and none of them were warm. Roland looked back with the specific patience of a man who stopped being intimidated by other men's expressions sometime in the previous decade. The evaluation parameters, Maddox said, are mine to define. The hit is documented, Roland said. That doesn't disappear because the parameters are inconvenient. The word inconvenient landed in the room like something dropped from height. Several men heard it and looked at Maddox and then looked away the way people look away from things that might require them to pick a side. Riley had not looked up from her notebook. Voss, Maddox said her name, the way you say a word you've decided is less important than the sentence it's in. Your debrief. Keep it brief. She closed the notebook. She stood. She didn't look around the tent for validation or invitation. She just stood and she spoke. My firing solution accounted for 4 primary variables, she said. Standard wind calculation, Coriolis correction for our latitude, and azimuth temperature, adjusted ballistic coefficient, and mirage cycle timing. She paused. The first 3 are textbook. The 4th one isn't in the field manual. She looked at Maddox directly. It should be. Nobody moved. You timed the mirage, Barnes said. It wasn't skeptical. It was something closer to the specific focus of a man who has realized he's learning something. Yes, Riley said. The mirage in these conditions runs in compression cycles as surface temperature increases. The intervals shorten across the day. During the flat periods, roughly 90 seconds each, the apparent target displacement caused by refraction drops to near zero. If you time your shot to that window, you remove the most significant source of optical error at this distance. How do you time it? Chen asked. You watch, she said simply, long enough to establish the pattern. This morning's pattern started at roughly 11-minute intervals and had compressed to about 8 by the time I shot. I logged 10 cycles before I was confident enough in the interval to use it. Chen was very still. 10 cycles, he said. Yes, that's over an hour of observation. Closer to 90 minutes, Riley said. I started when I arrived. The room absorbed this. Barnes leaned forward, elbows on knees. So while we were shooting, he said, you were watching. Yes. Watching us miss. Yes. And you knew why we were missing. Riley hesitated for the first time. Not because she was uncertain of the answer, but because she was weighing the answer against the room, against 12 men who had missed, and were still processing that fact against a staff sergeant who was holding the room with crossed arms and a tight jaw, in the particular stillness of a man who is deciding how much of a problem this is going to become. I had a strong theory about why, she said. But you didn't say anything, Barnes said. I was 13th on the roster, she said. I was waiting my turn. Something moved through the tent. It wasn't a sound. It was more like a shift in atmospheric pressure, the collective unspoken recognition of something that everyone present understood, but that nobody was going to name directly, because naming it directly would have required a level of candor that this particular environment did not, as a structural matter, support. Maddox uncrossed his arms. He crossed them again differently, which meant the same thing it always means when someone uncrosses and recrosses their arms, that they've had a thought they didn't like and are restoring the posture of certainty they held before the thought. The technique you described, he said, mirage cycle timing. Where does that come from? My father, Riley said. He was a long-range shooter. He spent years in desert conditions, and he developed the observation method over time. He documented it in personal logs, but it was never formally published. She paused. Captain Hale at Naval Precision Warfare validated it 3 years ago when I came through his program. He's the one who suggested I quantify the intervals and build it into a repeatable protocol. Captain Hale, Maddox said. Yes. I know Hale, as Maddox said, and the way he said it suggested that knowing Hale did not automatically constitute an endorsement of everything associated with Hale. Most people in this field do, Riley said neutrally. Maddox looked at her for a long moment. The technique works once, he said, under specific conditions, on this range, today. That is not a methodology, that is a circumstance. Riley looked back at him. She did not flinch, but something in her eyes changed, a narrowing that was so slight it was almost not there, except that Roland saw it and Chen saw it, and Barnes, who had been watching her face more carefully than he'd been watching anyone else in this tent for the last 15 minutes, saw it too. With respect, she said, hourly, I've replicated it 14 times at ranges between 2,800 and 3,800 meters across 6 different environments. Desert, semi-arid, coastal flatland, high altitude. The cycle intervals vary by conditions. The pattern holds. Maddox said nothing. I have the logs if you'd like to see them, Riley said. I brought copies. She reached into the front pocket of her backpack and produced a folded set of papers. Clean-tabbed, organized with the thoroughness of someone who knew she was going to be asked to prove things and had prepared accordingly. She set them on the table at the front of the tent. Maddox did not pick them up. Chen did. He unfolded them quietly, standing to one side, and began to read. His face did not give much away, but his reading pace slowed after the first page, which with Chen meant something. He was a fast reader, and slowing down meant the material was earning more attention than he'd expected to give it. 14 replications. Chen said not quite to Maddox, not quite to Riley, more to the mathematics of the situation. Yes, Riley said, different latitudes. 5 different latitudes. The Coriolis correction varies, but the mirage cycle behavior is consistent with an environmental type. Chen set the papers down. He looked at Maddox. He said nothing. But the look and the setting down of the papers and the saying nothing combined into a single communication that was readable by everyone in the tent. Maddox picked up the papers. He looked at the first page. He turned to the second. His face was to his credit, giving nothing away in a technical sense. He could have been reading a maintenance manual for something he considered beneath his attention. But his hands, Roland noticed, were holding the paper slightly more firmly than the weight of the paper required. He set them down. We'll include this in the post-evaluation report, he said, as supplementary data. Supplementary. Dyer looked at the ceiling. Barnes pressed his lips together. Roland looked at his own hands, folded in his lap. Riley said nothing. She sat back down. She opened her notebook. She wrote one line which nobody could read from where they sat, and then she closed the notebook again. The debrief continued. Maddox moved them through administrative matters, range clearance equipment, returned transport back to base. He was efficient and thorough, and gave no one any reason to pause or question the proceeding on procedural grounds. He was in the mechanics of running a debrief, doing everything right. It was only in the content of what he was choosing not to say that the problem lived, and it was a problem that was gathering weight the way these problems do, quietly and in the spaces between official words, where the unofficial reality of a situation solidifies into something that everyone carries home, but nobody files a report about. It was Sergeant First Class Dyer who broke first. Not angrily, not even loudly. He broke the way men sometimes break when they've been sitting with something that's too heavy to stay sitting with. He just let it out simply and without fanfare, because he was not a complicated man, and the situation had stopped feeling like something he could stay quiet about. She hit it, Dyer said. Maddox turned. That's all, Dyer said. He gestured with one hand, an open, almost apologetic gesture, like a man conceding a point at a card table. I'm not making a speech. I just think she hit it 14 times. We didn't hit it once. That seems like it matters. The tent was very still. Maddox looked at Dyer the way commanding officers look at subordinates who have said true things at inconvenient moments, with a kind of controlled disappointment that is heavier than anger, because anger can be discharged and disappointment just sits there. What it tells us, Maddox said, is that under specific conditions, a specific technique produced a specific result. We will evaluate whether that result is replicable and whether the technique merits formal study. He looked around the tent. That is what this evaluation process is for. That is why we are here. The answer to one result is not a conclusion. It is the beginning of a question. It was a well-constructed response, technically defensible, procedurally correct. And every person in that tent knew it was something else too. Roland stood up. He did it slowly, the way he did everything, with the unhurried deliberateness of a man who has decided that hurrying stopped serving him some years ago. He picked up his hat. He looked at Maddox. Dominic, he said. Roland was one of approximately 3 people in the world who called Maddox by his first name, and doing so now was not an accident. It was a reduction, a deliberate, careful removal of rank from the space between them, so that what was said next would land as one man speaking to another. I've been doing this for 40 years. I've seen a lot of shooters, men mostly, a few women. Some of the best shots I've ever witnessed were people that someone somewhere decided didn't fit the picture before they ever picked up a rifle. He paused. I'm not telling you what to think. I'm telling you what I've seen. He looked at Riley briefly, then back at Maddox. Don't let the picture get in the way of what's in front of you. He walked out of the tent. After a moment, several of the other men began to follow, not in a coordinated way, not as a statement, just the natural dissolution of a debrief that had reached its natural endpoint, which is the moment when the official business is done and the unofficial reality is too obvious for anyone to pretend otherwise. Chen paused near Riley on his way out. He picked up the logs she had set on the table and handed them to her. Make a copy for me, he said quietly. I want to work through the gradient correlation data. Riley looked at him. Of course. He nodded once, walked out. Barnes paused too briefly near the tent entrance. He looked back at Riley. He seemed to want to say something. He seemed on consideration to decide that what he wanted to say would take longer than the moment allowed. He settled for a good shot, which was not everything he meant, but was the part of it he could get out cleanly. Thank you, Riley said. And then the tent was empty except for Riley and Maddox. She was putting her notebook into her backpack. He was looking at the range report on his tablet, or appearing to look at it, which was a slightly different thing. Voss, he said. She stopped, looked at him. The logs, he said. The 14 replications. He didn't look up from the tablet. I'll want the originals, not copies. It was a power move. Small, precise, dressed in procedural language. The originals of her father's methodology documentation. The years of work, he wanted the originals, not the copies, because asking for the originals meant she would have to hand over something she couldn't duplicate, and that was a kind of control. And control was what this conversation had been about from the moment she walked onto the range. Riley looked at him for a moment. I'll send you scanned originals, she said. I keep the physical documents. Maddox looked up. Something moved in his face that resolved into nothing visible. Fine, he said. She zipped her backpack. She slung it over one shoulder. Staff Sergeant, she said. He looked at her. The next time this range runs an evaluation at this distance, she said, the gradient model needs to be updated every 90 minutes, not every 4 hours. And someone needs to log the mirage intervals from first light. If you build that into the protocol, the group's hit probability at this range goes up significantly. She paused. Not just for one shooter, for everyone. He said nothing. I'm not trying to make you look bad, she said. I'm trying to make the methodology better. Those aren't the same thing. She walked out of the tent. Maddox stood alone in the empty space, tablet in hand, the afternoon heat pressing in at the edges of the canvas and the range logs on the table in front of him, showing in clean official Type 1 confirmed hit at 3,600 meters by a shooter he had crossed off the roster before she ever fired a round. He looked at the log for a long time. Then he set down the tablet. He walked to the observation scope, which was still trained, downrange, still aimed at the steel plate 2 miles away in the hammering afternoon sun. He bent to the eyepiece. He looked. Dead center. The mark was unmistakable, the bright scar of impact on dark steel, clean and circular, and exactly where it had no business being, given everything Maddox had believed about this range and this distance and the shooter who had put it there. He stood up from the scope. Outside the tent, he could hear the sound of vehicles and the low voices of men packing equipment, and somewhere further away the sound of Roland's voice and Riley's voice in what was clearly a conversation that neither of them had announced they were going to have. He couldn't hear the words. He didn't move toward them. He picked up his tablet. He opened the post-evaluation report template. He typed for a moment, stopped, deleted what he'd written, typed again. He saved it without finishing it. He looked at the range one more time, at the steel plate 2 miles away, at the bright afternoon sky above it, at the shimmering air between here and there that Riley Voss had read like a sentence and used like a tool. He thought about his father, which was not something he did often and was not something he'd expected to do today. His father who had taught him to shoot. His father who had told him that the most dangerous thing a sniper could carry into the field was not a weapon, but a certainty, the belief that you already knew everything the situation was going to teach you. He had not thought about that advice in years. He was thinking about it now. He closed the report. He picked up the range logs. He found the page with the confirmed hit, the coordinates, the timestamp, the observer's signature. He did not delete it. He did not mark it supplementary. He looked at it for a long time, then he filed it exactly where it belonged. 3 days after the Yuma evaluation, a memo landed on the desk of Commander Patricia Okafor at Naval Special Warfare Command in Coronado. It was brief, professionally worded, signed by Staff Sergeant Dominic Maddox, countersigned by Senior Chief Rowland, and attached to a range report that contained on page 4 a confirmed hit at 3,600 meters, documented in clean official type, with a timestamp and an observer signature that made it by every institutional standard real. Okafor read the memo twice. Then she read the range report. Then she sat back in her chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment, the way people do when information arrives that rearranges something they thought was settled. She picked up her phone and called Captain Aiden Hale. He answered on the second ring. "You've seen the Yuma report," she said. "I have," Hale said. "Tell me about Voss." There was a pause on the line, not hesitation, but the specific pause of a man who has a great deal to say and is deciding where to start. "Riley Voss came through my program 18 months ago," he said. "She was the quietest student I've had in 20 years of teaching. Didn't talk much, didn't perform, just worked. Every day she was the first one on the range and the last one off." He paused again. "She also had better instincts for atmospheric reading than anyone I've trained, including some instructors I know. Her father was the shooter," Okafor said. "Her father was Thomas Voss," Hale said. 38 years Army. He developed the Mirage Interval Protocol on his own time over about a decade of field observation. Never published it. He taught it to Riley when she was a teenager on weekends in the desert outside Tucson. She's been refining it ever since. Okafor looked at the range report again. "Maddox filed this as a confirmed hit," she said. "He could have filed it as supplementary. He chose not to." "I noticed that," Hale said. "What do you make of it?" Hale was quiet for a moment. "I think Maddox is a hard man who doesn't like being wrong," he said. "But I also think he's honest enough that when wrong gets in front of his face and stays there long enough, eventually he files it where it belongs." He paused. "That's rarer than it sounds." Okafor set down the report. "I'm pulling her in," she said. "I want her here." "For evaluation, for instruction," Okafor said. "If the technique is what the report says it is, I want it in the curriculum before another training cycle starts." There was a silence on the line that had a quality to it, the quality of someone who is pleased but is not going to say so with any particular enthusiasm, because enthusiasm is not the register in which these conversations are conducted. "She'll be good at it," Hale said finally. "I know," Okafor said. "That's why I'm calling you instead of just sending the orders." She hung up. She looked at the memo on her desk one more time. Then she signed the reassignment orders for Petty Officer Riley Voss, Naval Precision Warfare School, Coronado, California, effective in 14 days. She sealed the envelope herself. Riley got the orders on a Tuesday morning, standing in the parking lot of her base housing unit in Virginia Beach, with a coffee in one hand and her phone in the other, reading the official email that had arrived at 6:12. She read it once. She read it again. She stood still for a moment, with the coffee going cold in her hand and the early morning sounds of a base coming awake around her engines. Distant voices, a helicopter, somewhere north, cutting through low cloud. She thought about her father. She thought about a specific afternoon in the Sonoran Desert when she was 14 years old, lying flat on hot ground beside a man who smelled like gun oil and sunscreen, squinting through a borrowed scope at a target 800 meters away, and he had said to her in the way he said most important things, quietly without ceremony, "You're not looking at the target, Riley. You're looking at everything between you and the target. That's the whole game, everything in between." She put her phone in her pocket. She finished the coffee. She started packing that same afternoon. Coronado was different from Yuma, the way the ocean is different from the desert. Not better or worse, just a different kind of unforgiving. The Naval Precision Warfare School occupied a section of the base that smelled permanently of salt air and gun solvent, and the ranges there were longer and more varied than most civilian shooters ever see, with crosswind corridors that came off the Pacific in patterns that were simultaneously beautiful and technically brutal. Riley reported to Captain Hale's office at 800 on her first day, 14 days after the orders arrived. Hale was 60 years old, thin and straight-backed, with white hair cut close and eyes that were so consistently focused. They gave the impression of a man who had long ago made peace with seeing exactly what was in front of him, rather than what he wanted to be there. He had been in naval special warfare for 35 years. He had known Thomas Voss, not well a few shared conferences, a correspondence that started when Thomas mailed him a 12-page handwritten document titled simply Observations on Atmospheric Reading at Distance, with a note that said, "Hale, you might find this useful." That document was still in Hale's filing cabinet. He had read it 4 times. "Sit down, Riley," he said. She sat. She was in uniform, back, straight hands in her lap. She looked like what she was, someone who had spent a significant portion of her adult life being assessed by people in positions of authority and had learned to meet that assessment with stillness rather than performance. "You've seen the curriculum," Hale said. "Yes, sir." "Tell me what's wrong with it." She blinked. It was the first time in this conversation that her expression had changed at all. "Sir, the curriculum, Saul," he said. "Current precision warfare instruction, atmospheric variables module specifically. You've read it. Tell me what's wrong with it." She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "It treats atmospheric variables as inputs to a static calculation. Wind speed measured at one point in time applied as a uniform value across the entire shot distance. Temperature same measured at the firing point and projected. It doesn't account for the dynamic behavior of those variables across the range column. The air between the shooter and the target isn't the same air from point to point. It's layered, it's moving, it's changing. Treating it as uniform is like navigating by a map drawn this morning when you're driving this afternoon." Hale said nothing. "The Mirage interval method addresses part of that gap," Riley continued, "but it's not complete by itself. It needs to be paired with mid-range gradient observation and a recalibration protocol that updates the firing solution in real time as conditions change, not once before the shot and then locked." She paused. "The current curriculum gets shooters to 2,000 meters reliably. Beyond that, the static model starts generating errors that compound with distance. By 3,500 meters, those errors are the difference between a hit and a miss by 12 feet. Hale looked at her for a long moment. 20 students, he said, many of them experienced, some with more confirmed long-range hits than you have years of service. They will not be easy to teach." "I know," she said. "Some of them will resent being taught." "I know that too. And some of them," Hale said, "will resent being taught by you specifically, not because of your technique, because of what you look like and where you came from, and the fact that you're going to stand in front of them and tell them that what they've been doing is incomplete." He paused. "How do you handle that?" Riley was quiet for a moment. She looked at her hands. She looked back at Hale. "My father used to say that you can't teach someone who's already decided they know everything," she said. "But you can shoot in front of them, and if you shoot well enough, they start listening. Not because you convince them, because the physics convince them, and you just happen to be holding the rifle." Hale looked at her for another long moment. Then he picked up a folder from his desk and handed it across. "Curriculum review is yours. You have 2 weeks before the cohort arrives. I want your revisions to the atmospheric module on my desk in 10 days. Full lesson plans, range protocols, assessment criteria." She took the folder. "And Riley," he said. She looked up. "Your father sent me a document 12 years ago," he said. "I still have it. I'm going to give you a copy before you leave today because there are things in it that you might find useful as a teacher that you might not remember him saying as a student." Something crossed her face that she did not try to suppress and did not fully show. It was the expression of someone receiving something unexpected and private in a professional setting, the expression of someone who has spent a long time carrying a person's memory alone. "Thank you," she said quietly. "Don't thank me," Hale said. "Use it." The cohort arrived 12 days later, 20 students, 16 men, 4 women, ranks ranging from petty officer second class to senior chief, combat deployments collectively spanning more theaters than Riley could count. They arrived the way experienced military personnel always arrive at training they didn't request, with a particular combination of compliance and skepticism that says, "I will do this because I am ordered to do this, and I reserve the right to form my own conclusions about whether it was worth my time." Riley watched them file into the classroom from the front of the room, where she was standing without any particular announcement of her presence, just standing, because she had learned a long time ago that how you occupy a space before anyone gives you permission to occupy it tells people more about you than any introduction ever could. The first man through the door was Senior Chief Garrett Holloway. He was 44, built like a man who took up space by habit rather than by intention, with a quiet authority about him that came from years of being the most experienced person in most rooms he entered. He saw Riley at the front. He took in her rank. He sat down in the back row. The second man was Petty Officer First Class Deshaun Marks, 29, fast-eyed, with the kind of physical stillness that told you he processed the world quickly and spent very little energy on anything that didn't require it. He sat in the middle of the room. He looked at Riley without expression. By the time all 20 were seated, the room had the particular quality that classrooms have, when the students have not yet decided what they think of the instructor, a provisional, quiet, watchful, and uncommitted. Riley walked to the whiteboard. She picked up a marker. She wrote one number on the board, 3,600. She set down the marker. She turned around. That's the range at which the current precision shooting curriculum begins to fail, she said. Not because the physics fail, because the methodology does. The physics are reliable. The methodology is incomplete. She looked around the room. Everything you've learned about long-range shooting is correct. I'm not here to tell you that anything you know is wrong. I'm here to show you what comes after it. Holloway from the back row said after it. Yes. After 30 years of precision training, he said. The tone was not aggressive. It was the tone of a man examining a claim that strikes him as larger than the person making it. After 30 years, as she said, you hit targets reliably to 2,000, maybe 2,500 meters under field conditions. Beyond that, your hit rate drops significantly, not because of skill, because of the method. She paused. I know because I've looked at the range data. The cohorts that have come through this program in the last decade, their hit rates at ranges above 3,000 meters are below 12%. The room stirred. 12%, Mark said from the middle of the room. 12%, Riley confirmed. One hit in 8 attempts, at a range that is increasingly relevant to modern engagement doctrine. She looked at the board at the number she'd written. By the end of 12 weeks, I want that number above 60% for this cohort, under field conditions. The room was quiet in the way rooms get quiet when a statement has been made that people are not yet sure whether to take seriously. Holloway crossed his arms. 60% at 3,600 meters, he said. In 12 weeks. Yes. Has that been done before? No, she said, which is why we're doing it now. The first week was brutal in the precise and measurable way that technical instruction is brutal when it requires experienced people to unlearn things, not unlearn, rebuild, which is harder because you can only rebuild something after you've taken it apart, and taking apart something you've built your career on is not a comfortable process, regardless of how intellectually honest you are. Riley ran the first day's range session in silence. She set up the students at 1,500 meters well within their established capability, and she watched. She watched for 40 minutes without saying a single word, taking notes in the small notebook that had been her constant companion since Yuma. She watched how they read when. She watched when they shot. She watched whether they waited or whether they performed a waiting, which is a different thing entirely. Performed. Waiting is the posture of patience without the underlying attention, and it is extremely common in experienced shooters who have learned that stillness looks like expertise even when it isn't producing it. After 40 minutes, she called them off the line. Holloway, she said, how many times in the last 40 minutes did you check the wind before you shot? Holloway considered. Twice, maybe 3 times. Once, Riley said, you checked it once. The second time you looked at the sensor, you were confirming something you'd already decided, not reading new data. There's a difference. She looked around the group. Most of you did the same thing. You made a decision about the conditions within the first 5 minutes, and then you spent the rest of the time defending that decision with your body language instead of updating it with new information. Mark squinted. That sounds like psychology, she said. Yes, shooting is psychology as much as it's physics. At 1,500 meters, the physics carry you through the psychology. At 3,500, they don't. She looked at him directly. Your mind will lie to you about what the conditions are. Your firing solution will feel correct even when it's stale. The discipline isn't building the solution. It's rebuilding it every 90 seconds, even when every instinct you have says you already have it right. Mark said nothing for a moment. Then quietly, how do you train that? By being wrong, she said, deliberately. We're going to spend this week making shots that we know are going to miss, and we're going to log exactly why they miss, and then we're going to update the solution and shoot again. You're going to be wrong approximately 40 times before you start being right. That's the process. Holloway unfolded his arms. Not a surrender, a reconsideration. The physical equivalent of a man who has picked off something heavier than he expected and is adjusting his grip. 40 times, he said. At least, she said. The second mini-climax hit on day 4. Marks hit a target at 2,800 meters after 3 consecutive misses. The hit was not luck. It was the product of a firing solution he had rebuilt from scratch after Riley had stood behind him for 8 minutes in total silence. Watching him recalculate, watching him resist the urge to use the number he had started with, because it felt familiar, watching him finally let go of the familiar number and build a new one from current data. The round hit the steel. Marks stayed behind the rifle for a moment. Then he stood up. He looked at Riley. He did not say anything dramatic. He said, "Huh." Just that. One syllable. But the way he said it, the quality of surprise in it, the genuine recalibration, was worth more than any formal acknowledgement could have been. Riley wrote something in her notebook. Holloway, watching from 3 positions down the line, saw the hit and said nothing. He turned back to his own scope. He looked at his firing solution. He deleted the wind value he'd been carrying for the last 20 minutes and pulled fresh data from the sensor. He rebuilt from current conditions. He fired. Hit. 2,600 meters. Clean. He stood up. He looked at the range officer for confirmation. Got it. He turned to find Riley. She was already writing in the notebook. "You didn't watch," he said. "I didn't need to," she said. "I heard the difference in the timing." He stared at her. "The timing. You waited 4 minutes longer than your last shot before you fired," she said. "That's long enough to have pulled fresh data and rebuilt the solution. I know the difference between someone waiting and someone working." She looked at him. "You were working." Something shifted in Holloway's face. Not dramatically. Just a small movement around the eyes that was the physical expression of a man updating a conclusion he had formed about someone. "The technique," he said. "The mirage cycles. You really learned that as a kid." "Yes." "From your father?" "Yes." He looked out toward the range. "My dad tried to teach me to fish," he said. "I hated it. I had no patience for it when I was young." He paused. "I wish I'd listened better." Riley looked at him. The notebook was in her hand, but she wasn't writing. "You're listening now," she said. He picked up his rifle. He went back to the line. The twist came on day 9. Riley arrived at 0600 for the morning range session and found Hale waiting for her outside the armory. He was holding a printout. His expression was the expression of a man who has information he did not request and is now required to deliver. "Maddox filed a formal challenge to the Yuma hit," Hale said. Riley went still. "He submitted a technical review request to Army Marksmanship Command," Hale continued. "He's arguing that the shot should be reclassified as conditions dependent rather than methodology confirmed. He wants it removed from the official evaluation record as a clean hit." He paused. "It was filed yesterday. I got the notification this morning." Riley said nothing for a moment. The morning air was cool off the Pacific, and somewhere down the range a door was opening, and students were moving toward the line, and everything that was supposed to happen today was supposed to happen in the next 30 minutes. But the information Hale had just given her landed with a weight that was not going to be quickly redistributed. "He can do that," she said finally. "Not a question, just a reckoning." "He can file the request," Hale said. "Whether it goes anywhere depends on the review board." He looked at her carefully. "It also depends on the data you can provide in response. Your logs, the replication records, the methodology documentation." "I have all of it," she said. "Amen." "I know you do," he said. "That's not what concerns me." "What concerns you?" she asked. Hale looked at the printout in his hand. "The timing," he said. "He filed this 9 days after your cohort started. 9 days after news started circulating about what you're doing here and how the students are responding." He looked at her. He waited to see if you were going to succeed, and then he moved. The implication settled between them. "He's not challenging the shot," Riley said quietly. "No," Hale said. "He's challenging what the shot opens the door to." She stood with that for a moment. A seabird called somewhere above them, sharp and brief. Down the range she could hear Holloway's voice low and steady. talking one of the younger students through a position adjustment. "What do I do?" she asked. Hale folded the printout, put it in his jacket pocket. "You do what you're doing," he said. "You teach, you document, you build the record so thoroughly that there is no version of a review board decision that can ignore it." He looked at her directly. "You don't fight Maddox on his terms. You win on yours." She looked at him. "And if the board sides with him, then we appeal," he said simply. "And we keep going." He paused. "Your father spent a decade documenting a methodology that nobody paid attention to while he was alive. You've been doing it for 6 years. One review board doesn't end that." She looked at the range, at the students taking their positions in the early light, checking wind pulling data, rebuilding solutions from current conditions, the way she taught them to do it. She thought about her father sitting in a folding chair in the Arizona desert at dusk, writing in a notebook by the light of a headlamp, documenting something he knew might take years for anyone else to understand. She thought about patience. She thought about the difference between patience and waiting, which is the same difference as between working and performing. "Okay," she said. She picked up her own rifle case. She walked to the range. She had 20 students who needed to be taught, and a review board that would receive whatever she built here whether they wanted to or not, in a methodology that the physics had already confirmed regardless of what any form said about it. She called the cohort to attention. They straightened. They looked at her. "Day 9, she said. "We're moving to 2,000 meters today. By the end of this session, I want every one of you rebuilding your firing solution on a 90-second cycle. Not because I'm asking you to, because you've started to feel what happens when you don't." She looked down the line. "You've felt it this week. You know the difference now between a stale solution and a live one." She paused. "Today we make it automatic. Let's go." They went to the line. And Riley stood behind them, notebook in hand, watching not the target, but everything between here and there. The way her father had taught her, the way she was teaching them, the knowledge passing forward through the chain of attention that is the only thing that outlasts any single person's reach. The review board notification arrived on a Wednesday, day 17 of the 12-week program at 7:43 in the morning while Riley was standing behind Petty Officer Marks at the 2,000-meter line watching him work through his third consecutive firing solution rebuild of the session. She felt her phone vibrate in her jacket pocket. She did not look at it. She kept her eyes on Marks on the way. His shoulders were sitting on the rhythm of his breathing, on the small movements of his hands that told her whether he was working or whether he was performing. Working, and Marks had reached the point where the difference was rarely performance anymore. He was working. She could feel it from 3 feet behind him, the way you can feel heat without touching a surface. He fired. The steel sang at 2,000 meters. "Clean," she wrote in her notebook. Then she looked at her phone. The review board had scheduled a formal hearing. Army Marksmanship Command Joint Panel 3 members. Date 4 weeks out. Riley was required to submit her full methodology documentation, all replication logs, range records, and a written technical defense of the Yuma shot within 10 days. Maddox's challenge had been formally accepted for review. She put the phone back in her pocket. She called the next shooter to the line. She did not tell the cohort. Not that day. Not because she was hiding it. She wasn't built for hiding things, but because what was happening on this range in these 12 weeks was not going to be interrupted by something happening in a conference room. 4 weeks from now, and the way to make that true was to keep her attention exactly where it was on 20 students who were in the middle of becoming something they hadn't been before they arrived. That evening, she sat at the desk in her quarters and began building the defense document. She had the logs, all 14 replications meticulously recorded. Date stamped, witnessed where possible with atmospheric data attached to each entry. She had Hale's written validation from 3 years ago. She had range officer confirmations from Yuma. She had the post-shot observation scope photograph that Tate had taken showing the impact point dead center on the steel plate, which was the kind of evidence that does not negotiate. She opened her father's document, the 12-page handwritten original that Hale had scanned and given her a copy of the one Thomas Voss had mailed to a Navy captain 12 years ago because he believed the physics was right and he believed someone eventually needed to know about it. His handwriting was the handwriting of a precise man, small, clean, evenly spaced, the kind of writing that suggests the writer thought carefully before putting pen to paper. She had seen it 1,000 times on shopping lists, on birthday cards, on the margins of books he'd read twice. Seeing it here in the context of this document, in the context of this defense, she was building produced a feeling she did not try to name or suppress. She just let it be there. The way you let a thing be there when you know naming it doesn't change its weight. She read through his observations. She had read them before many times, but each time she read them, she found something she had understood differently than she understood it now. Because understanding deepens over time the way everything real deepens, not by accumulation of new information, but by living with existing information until it opens up. She wrote for 3 hours. When she was done, the defense document was 31 pages. She sent it to Hale at 2300. He responded at 2317. One line, this is enough, more than enough. Sleep. She did not sleep easily, but she slept. Day 18 began at 05:30 with a knock on her door that was not Hale and was not a phone notification. It was Holloway. He was in PT gear, which meant he'd been up since at least 04:30, which meant something was on his mind that running hadn't resolved. Can I come in? He said. She stepped back. He came in. He sat in the single chair near the window. She sat on the edge of the desk. Word travels, he said. She waited. The review board thing, he said. Maddox's challenge. I heard it from Paulson, who heard it from someone at Marksmanship Command. He looked at her directly. Is it true? Yes, she said. He was quiet for a moment. Why didn't you tell us? Because it doesn't change what we're doing. It changes what's at stake, he said. No, she said. It changes who's paying attention. What's at stake was always the same. Holloway looked at his hands. He was a man who thought with his hands. Sometimes he'd look at them when he was working through something the way some people look at the ceiling. I've been in the Navy for 22 years, he said. I've watched good people get their work buried because someone with more rank decided the work was inconvenient. It happens. It happens more than it should, and it happens to certain people more than others. He paused. I don't want that to happen here. Riley looked at him. What are you going to do about it? He looked up. What can I do about it? You were at Yuma, she said. You weren't in this cohort at that point, but you know people who were. You know Senior Chief Paulson. You know Chen. She paused. Witness statements from credentialed observers carry weight with a review board. I have the documentation, but documentation from an interested party from me carries less weight than confirmation from people who have no stake in the outcome. Holloway was very still. Are you asking me to? I'm not asking you for anything, Riley said. I'm telling you what would help. What you do with that is your decision. He looked at her for a long moment, then he stood up. He moved toward the door. He stopped. Your father, he said, did he ever get the credit for the methodology? She looked at him steadily. Not while he was alive. Holloway nodded slowly, the way a man nods when a fact confirms something he suspected and wishes it didn't. I'll make some calls, he said. He left. Day 21. The cohort hit a wall. It happened the way walls happen in training, and not dramatically, not all at once, but as a cumulative heaviness that settles over a group after 3 weeks of hard work and before the work has begun to pay off in the way that is visible enough to sustain motivation. The students were shooting better. Objectively, measurably better, their firing solution rebuild times were down. Their atmospheric read accuracy was up, their groupings, at 2,000 meters, had tightened significantly. But they were not yet hitting reliably at 3,000, which was where the program needed them to go, and 3,000 was a distance that felt, after 3 weeks of effort, less like a goal and more like a taunt. Marks was the one who said it. He said it after a session where he had had 4 consecutive misses at 2,800 meters, each one close enough to be insulting and far enough to be uncorrectable with small adjustments. I don't think I can learn this, he said. He said it quietly, not to anyone in particular, setting his rifle down and looking at the range with the expression of a man who has been fighting something for 3 weeks and has run out of the specific kind of energy that fighting requires. I think there's something in this technique that I don't have, that I can't develop. The range was quiet. Riley had heard this before, not in this room, not from this person, but she had heard this exact thing, this precise collapse of confidence that sounds like honesty, but is actually exhaustion, dressed in honesty's clothing. She had heard it from herself once in the 3rd month of her father's teaching, when she'd been 19 and furious and had set down her rifle and told him she didn't have whatever it was that he had, that some people could read atmosphere and some people couldn't. And she was the kind of person who couldn't. Her father had not argued with her. He had picked up the rifle and handed it back. He had said, "You're not missing because you can't see the conditions. You're missing because you don't trust what you see. Those are different problems, and only one of them is permanent." She walked to Marks. She crouched beside him at the line which put her physically below him, which was a deliberate choice. She was not standing over him when she spoke. "Tell me the last shot," she said. "Walk me through it." He sighed. Wind was reading variable, 7 to 11 knots from the southwest. Temperature gradient was running about what we've been seeing. I built a solution held for a flat window and the Mirage fired. "What did the Mirage look like when you fired?" she said. He paused. I thought it was flattening. It looked like it was going into the flat phase. "But," she said. He looked at her. "But I wasn't sure. It was close. I thought I was catching the front edge of the flat window." "You weren't sure," she said. "No. But you fired anyway." He was quiet. "That's not a technique problem," Riley said. "That's a trust problem. You saw something that wasn't quite right, and you fired anyway because you'd been waiting and you wanted to be done waiting." She looked at him steadily. "The technique was correct. Your read was close. The error was in the decision to fire on a close read instead of waiting for a clear one." Marks looked at the range. His jaw was tight. "How long do you wait?" he said. "How many times do you rebuild the solution? How many windows do you watch pass before you accept that this is as good as it gets and you take the shot?" Riley looked at the range too. "Until you're certain," she said. "Not comfortable, certain. There's a difference, and you already know the difference because you've been there. You've had shots this week where you waited and you knew. You felt the moment when the solution and the conditions lined up and everything got quiet." She looked at him. "That's not a feeling you develop. It's a feeling you learn to trust. And trust takes longer than technique." Marks looked at his hands. He picked up the rifle. He settled back into position. He waited. 9 minutes passed. The range was silent. Holloway and the other students had quietly stopped their own sessions and were watching not intrusively, but with the awareness of people who understood that something instructive was happening. Marks fired. The steel rang at 2,800 meters. He stayed down behind the rifle for a moment. Then he stood up slowly. He turned to Riley. "That was the window," he said. "Yes," she said. "I felt it." "I know," she said. "I saw it in your hands." He looked at her. "You can read that from behind someone." "My father could read it from 20 feet, she said. "I'm still working on that." Something moved through the group. Not loud, not announced, just the particular shift that happens in a cohort when a lesson has been learned by one person and has been witnessed by everyone else, and the lesson is now part of the shared knowledge of the group in a way that no classroom instruction could have produced. Holloway was the first to go back to the line. He settled in. He pulled fresh data. He started rebuilding. The wall came down. Day 28 brought the second major twist. Riley was in Hale's office at 16:30 when he told her that Maddox had arrived on base. Not for the review board that was still a week and a half out. Maddox was here as part of a joint training assessment that had been scheduled months in advance and had nothing officially to do with the review process. He would be on base for 3 days. He would be observing several programs, including on day 2 of his visit, the Naval Precision Warfare School range sessions. Riley received this information in the same stillness that she received most information. She looked at Hale. He looked back at her. "Does he have to observe this program?" she said. "He's within his authorization to observe any joint training assessment component," Hale said. "I can't exclude him without cause." "Then I won't give him cause," she said. Hale nodded once. "Riley," he said. She looked at him. "He's going to watch," Hale said, "and what he sees is going to inform whatever he says to the review board, whether he's on the board or not. His opinion carries weight with the people who are." He paused. "I'm not saying change what you're doing. I'm saying be aware of what you're building for him to see." She stood up. "He's going to see a cohort that's 6 days from hitting 3,500 meters, she said. "He's going to see 20 students rebuilding firing solutions every 90 seconds and reading atmospheric conditions that they couldn't read a month ago." She paused. "If that's a problem for him, that's a problem he's going to have to solve." She walked out of the office. That evening, she told the cohort, all of it, the review board, Maddox has challenged the arrival on base. She told them, standing at the front of the classroom without softening it and without dramatizing it, just laying it out as information that they deserved to have. The room was quiet when she finished. Mark spoke first. "He's challenging your shot," he said. "The one at Yuma." "Yes." "The shot that got you here." "Yes." Marks looked around the group. He looked back at Riley. "So if the board sides with him, the methodology continues regardless," Riley said. "The board can reclassify a single confirmed hit. They cannot reclassify 14 replications with full atmospheric documentation. They cannot reclassify what this cohort has done in the last 4 weeks." She paused. "What you've built here doesn't disappear because someone files a form." Holloway from the back said, "What do you need from us?" She looked at him. "Shoot the way you've been shooting," she said. "That's everything." Maddox arrived on the range at 0900 on a Thursday morning, day 29. He came with an aide and a clipboard in the contained authority of a man who is observing rather than participating, which is its own kind of power, the power of the person who watches and says nothing and whose silence accumulates into judgment. He positioned himself at the edge of the range 20 feet from the firing line, and he watched. He watched Holloway settle into the position at 3,000 meters, pull data from the sensor array, rebuild his solution, check the mirage, and wait. Holloway waited 4 minutes and 20 seconds. Then he fired. The steel at 3,000 meters rang clearly audibly even at this distance, and Maddox's head moved slightly, not much, but it moved. He watched Marks at 3,200. Marks's setup time was longer than Holloway's. He was methodical in a way that was slower but more thorough, and his firing solution rebuilds were so consistent they looked almost mechanical. He fired on a mirage window that Riley had logged from 50 meters behind him before he fired, writing the window time in her notebook and then watching to see if Marks called it correctly. He did. The steel rang. Maddox watched this without expression. He watched 3 more students shoot. He made notes on his clipboard. He did not speak to Riley. After the 5th student, he walked to her. He stopped 4 feet away, which was the distance of a conversation that is being conducted with formality rather than ease. "The solution rebuild protocol," he said. 90 seconds. "Yes," she said. "That's what you're training them to." "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. He looked at the range at the student currently settling into position at 3,000 meters. "At Yuma," he said, "you told Chen that the mirage interval method needed to be paired with mid-range gradient observation, that the two together are what make the long-range solution reliable." She looked at him. He had done his reading. "Yes," she said. "The gradient observation," he said. "How long does it take to establish a usable baseline?" "In stable conditions, about 40 minutes, she said. "In variable conditions like Yuma, closer to 90. So the full protocol, setup, gradient, baseline plus mirage interval calibration, is 2 hours minimum before you have a reliable firing solution." "In conditions like Yuma, yes," she said. "In less variable environments, faster." He looked at the range again. The student at 3,000 fired. Hit. Maddox's pen moved on the clipboard. "That's the 3rd hit at 3,000 this session," he said. It was not quite a question. "4th, Riley said. He made a note. "The challenge I filed," he said, and now his voice had shifted. It hadn't softened exactly, but it had lost the controlled distance of someone conducting a formal observation and had moved towards something slightly more direct. "The basis of it is that the Yuma shot was condition-dependent, not replicable under standard field conditions." "I know the basis," Riley said. "I've read your defense document," he said. She said nothing. 14 replications, he said. 6 environments. Documented gradient data for each. He paused. "Your replication hit rate across those 14 attempts is 86%. "Yes," she said. He was quiet. He looked at the range. "Maddox," she said. He looked at her. "Why did you file the challenge?" she said. Not aggressively, genuinely. He held the question for a moment. He looked at his clipboard. He looked at the student taking position at the far end of the line. He said, "Because when something works, I need to understand why it works before I can trust it. I don't trust things that I can't break down into accountable components." He paused. "Your methodology is more complex than anything in the current curriculum. It requires a level of observational skill that takes time to develop and that I couldn't immediately replicate or verify." "That's not a reason to challenge the documentation," she said. "No," he said. "It isn't." He looked at her directly. That's why I came here. She held that. You came to see if it was teachable, she said. He didn't answer immediately. He looked at the range at Holloway, now behind the rifle at 3,500 meters, the first student to attempt this distance in a live session, settling in with the calm of a man who has spent 4 weeks building toward exactly this moment. The range was quiet. Everyone knew what was happening. Riley knew. Maddox knew. Holloway waited. He did not rush. He pulled data he rebuilt. He watched the mirage with the focused patience that 4 weeks ago he did not have, and that now lived in him as a natural process rather than a practiced one. He watched one window open and close without firing because something in the wind data told him to wait. He waited. The second window opened. He fired. The steel at 3,500 meters rang. The sound crossed the range and arrived at the firing line the way all sounds at distance arrive, slightly delayed, slightly changed by the journey but unmistakable. Maddox was very still. Riley wrote in her notebook. It's teachable, she said quietly. Maddox looked at the board at the end of the range where the range officer was updating the session hit log. He looked at the number. He looked at his clipboard. He said, I'm going to recommend the board close the challenge review. Riley turned to look at him. The documentation is sufficient, he said. The methodology is replicable. The instruction is producing results. He said it with the flat precision of a man making a technical assessment, not an apology, because it was not an apology. It was something more difficult than an apology. It was a correction self-imposed, which is the thing that separates the men who are truly good at what they do from the men who are merely talented and defensive. You'll put that in writing, she said. Today, he said. She looked at him. There were many things she could have said. She had carried this challenge for 19 days. She had built the defense document at midnight, reading her dead father's handwriting, feeling the weight of everything that had been dismissed and overlooked, and filed a supplementary when it deserved to be filed as confirmed. She could have said any of that. She said, thank you. He nodded once. He turned back to the range. After a moment, he said, without looking at her, your father's gradient documentation. The original 12 pages. Hale told me about it. He paused. It should be published. Riley looked at the range. Marks was taking position at 3,200. Holloway was sitting back from the line writing in his own notebook. He'd started keeping one, which Riley had noticed and noted, and which told her more about how this program had changed him than any range result could. I'm working on it, she said. I'll co-author if you want a second name on it, Maddox said. Army Marksmanship Command will pay more attention if the submission comes from both services. She looked at him. He was still looking at the range. That's not a favor, he said. That's a correct allocation of institutional weight. She thought about her father's handwriting on 12 pages of paper mailed to a man he'd never met because he believed the physics was right and that eventually someone would listen. She thought about how long eventually had taken. She thought about the document sitting in Hale's filing cabinet for 12 years being read 4 times by one careful man who understood what it was, but didn't yet have the person in front of him who could turn it from observation into curriculum. All right, she said, co-author. Marks fired at 3,200, hit. The session continued. The range rang at distances that had not rung in this program before, and Riley stood behind her students and watched and wrote and adjusted and corrected and waited. Always waited the way her father had taught her, that good teaching requires the same thing that good shooting requires, which is the patience to let the moment come to you instead of going to meet it before it's ready. By end of session, the range log showed 11 hits at ranges between 2,800 and 3,500 meters. 11 hits in a single session. Maddox looked at the log before he left the range. He stood at the board for a long moment, clipboard under his arm, looking at the numbers the way he'd looked at the observation scope at Yuma after Riley's shot, with the particular attention of a man who is giving something the respect it has earned from him. He walked past Riley on his way out. He didn't stop, but he slowed just slightly and said without turning, Day 9, Marks. I heard he almost quit. She looked at him. He didn't quit. No, Maddox said. He didn't. He kept walking. Neither did you. He left the range. Riley stood in the quiet that followed. Around her, students were clearing positions, breaking down equipment, talking in the low, easy voices of people who have worked hard and done something real and know it. Holloway was laughing at something Marks had said, and the laugh was genuine. The unguarded laugh of a man who is not performing ease but actually feeling it. She opened her notebook. She wrote the session results. She wrote Holloway's hit at 3,500, the distance and the time and the conditions, the way she logged everything precisely fully with the attention of someone who understands that the record is not just a record of what happened, but a proof of what is possible. She wrote one more line at the bottom of the page. It was her father's phrase, the one he'd used at the end of every session, scrawled in that small, clean handwriting and at the bottom of each page of his own logs, and she had adopted it without deciding to the way you adopt things that were given to you before you were old enough to choose. She wrote everything between here and there. She closed the notebook. She picked up her rifle case. She had 6 weeks left with this cohort in a co-authorship to begin, and 20 students who were 6 days from the distance that had started off of this 3,500 meters clean, documented, replicable, undeniable. She walked off the range. 6 days after Maddox left Coronado, the review board closed the challenge. The official notification arrived at 08:11 on a Monday morning, 3 lines of institutional language that translated in plain terms to this: the Yuma hit was confirmed. The methodology was validated as replicable, and the challenge filed by Staff Sergeant Dominic Maddox had been withdrawn by the filer prior to formal adjudication. Withdrawn, not overturned, not dismissed, withdrawn, by Maddox himself as he had said he would do, standing on the range watching Holloway's round ring steal at 3,500 meters. Hale read the notification first. He walked to the range at 08:20 and handed Riley his phone without a word. She read it once, handed it back. "How do you feel?" he said. She looked at the range where Marks and Holloway were already at the line running their morning atmospheric calibration notebooks out, pulling wind data, logging the conditions with the patient thoroughness that had become over 5 weeks as natural to them as breathing. "Like we have 6 weeks left," she said. He almost smiled. "Good answer." She walked to the line. What she did not say and what she would not say to anyone on this base was what she had felt at 08:13 when she handed the phone back, a feeling that had no clean name, that was part relief and part grief and part something that sat directly in the center of her chest and pressed outward in all directions simultaneously. It was the feeling of a thing being made right that should never have needed to be made right. It was the feeling of her father's 12 pages finally being given the institutional weight they deserved for 12 years. It was a feeling she recognized from one other moment in her life, which was the moment at Yuma when the observation scope confirmed the hit and the desert went quiet and the thing she'd waited for finally arrived. She did not let it slow her down. The final 6 weeks of the program ran at a different tempo than the first 6. The wall that had broken on day 21 did not rebuild itself. What replaced it was something quieter and more durable, the accumulated confidence of people who have been wrong enough times to trust themselves when they were right. The cohort moved through 3,200 meters, 3,400, and then on day 51 of the 12-week program, the full group attempted 3,500 for the first time in a live session. Riley stood behind them with her notebook. She said nothing. She watched. The first hit came from Marks. He had become over the weeks the most technically precise shooter in the cohort. Not the most instinctive, not the most decorated, but the one who had rebuilt his understanding of the process from the ground up with a thoroughness that produced the kind of consistency that impresses range officers and terrifies opposing forces. His round hit the steel at 3,500 at 10:43. He stayed behind the rifle for 2 full seconds after the impact, which in Marks was the equivalent of a celebration. He didn't pump his fist, he didn't shout, he just lay there for 2 seconds absorbing what had happened before he stood up and cleared the position. Riley was writing before the sound of the impact finished crossing the range. The second hit came from Holloway 11 minutes later. Holloway's technique had evolved over the program in a direction Riley hadn't fully predicted. He had become a teacher himself, almost without trying, the kind of senior presence in the cohort who corrected junior shooters, not because he'd been asked to, but because he couldn't watch someone make an error he knew how to fix without saying something about it. He hit at 3,500 and turned around and looked at Riley with an expression she recognized because she'd seen it before once in a very different face. The expression of someone who has arrived somewhere they weren't sure they could reach. "My father would have loved this," he said. Just that. Then he stepped back and let the next shooter take the line. By end of session, 9 of the 20 students had hit the 3,500-meter target at least once. 9 hits in a first live session at that distance. Riley wrote the number at the bottom of the page, underlined it once, closed the notebook. That evening, Hale called her into his office. He was on the phone when she arrived, and he held up one finger, wait, and finished his conversation in 3 sentences, precise and brief, before setting the phone down. I just spoke with Commander Okafor, he said, and with a representative from Allied Forces Training Command in Brussels. Riley sat down slowly. Brussels, she said. The program is getting attention, Hale said. The range data from the last 5 weeks has been circulating at the command level. Okafor briefed CENTCOM last week. Brussels reached out 48 hours ago. He looked at her. They want to send 6 observers for the final examination, NATO allied forces. They're considering adopting the methodology for their own long-range precision curriculum. The room was very quiet. 6 observers, Riley said, for the final exam. Yes, that changes the pressure on the students. It does, he said. I told them that. They said they understood. I'm telling you now because I want you to decide whether to tell the cohort before the exam or after it's scheduled. Riley looked at her hands. She thought about Marks, who had nearly quit on day 21 and who now hit 3,500 meters with a consistency that would have seemed impossible to him 6 weeks ago. She thought about Holloway, who had called her at 6 in the morning because he couldn't sleep for worrying about whether a review board was going to undo something true. She thought about the 3 women in the cohort, Petty Officer Second Class Dawson Senior Chief Reyes, Lieutenant Park, who had said almost nothing remarkable in 12 weeks and had done almost nothing unremarkable, who had worked with the kind of determined invisibility that Riley recognized intimately because she had lived inside it for most of her career. I'll tell them tomorrow, she said, before morning session. They deserve to know what they're shooting for. Hale nodded. Riley was on, he said. She looked at him. Your father's document, he said, the publication. Maddox submitted his co-author agreement to the Naval Warfare Studies Journal last week. I've been in contact with the editorial board. He paused. They want it. They said the methodology documentation is the most significant contribution to long-range precision theory they've received in 15 years. She looked at him for a long moment. 15 years, she said quietly. Their words, he said, not mine, though I agree with them. She stood up. She was going to say something. She stopped. She said instead, he really did it. He did, Hale said. I was surprised too. I shouldn't have been, but I was. He's a correct man, she said. He just needed the evidence to be undeniable. Most people are like that, Hale said. The ones worth knowing. She walked out. She did not go back to her quarters. She walked to the edge of the base where the perimeter met the sound, and she stood in the dark with the Pacific moving somewhere below her, and the base lights behind her, and the specific silence of a person who was alone with something large enough to require stillness. She stood there for a long time. She thought about her father, which she did every day but tonight with a particular intensity, with the image of him sitting at a kitchen table in Tucson, working through his notes, documenting something he believed in without any institutional support and without any assurance that it would ever matter beyond the two of them. She thought about what he would say if he were here, and she thought she knew, because she had known him well enough and long enough to carry the working model of him inside her with reasonable accuracy. He would say what he always said. He would say, keep going. She went back to her quarters. She slept. The morning she told the cohort the room had the specific energy of a group that has been working hard towards something and has just been told that something is watching. Not fear, not performance anxiety, something more complicated and more honest than either the awareness that what they had built here was real enough to have attracted the attention of people who could recognize real work. Marks took it the quietest. He sat in the second row and he listened to Riley explain the NATO observers and the final examination parameters, and when she finished, he asked one question. What's the pass threshold, he said. Bent consecutive hits at 3,500 meters per shooter, she said. Under field conditions, wind variable, no range officer calling holds. She paused. You call your own holds. You build your own solutions. You decide when to fire. The room absorbed this. 5 consecutive, Holloway said. Yes. What's the cohort pass rate? 75%, she said. 15 of 20 need to complete 5 consecutive hits. Holloway looked around the room. He was doing the mental math. He could see it in his face, the assessment of each person in the cohort against the standard, the calculation of who was there and who was close and who was going to need the next 3 weeks to close a gap that was real but closable. "We can do that," he said, not boastfully, factually the way he said things when he'd thought them through and arrived at a conclusion. "I know," Riley said. "That's why I'm telling you." The final 3 weeks were the hardest and the cleanest. Hard because the standard was real and the deadline was real and the observers were real, and none of those things could be softened without also softening what the program was. Clean because the cohort had stopped managing themselves against each other and had become, without a formal decision or announcement, a team, kind of team that only forms when people have been through enough difficulty together that the pretense of individual competition has been worn away by shared experience. Holloway helped Dawson with her win reading. Marks ran evening sessions with the 2 junior shooters who were furthest from the standard, not because he was assigned to, but because it didn't occur to him not to. Reyes, who was the most technically sophisticated shooter in the cohort and had been quietly, systematically one of the most consistent hitters since week 3, began documenting her own observations in a notebook that she'd started keeping after watching Riley do it for 12 weeks. Riley saw all of it. She wrote all of it. She said very little about it because the thing that was happening because of what she had built, not because of what she said about what she'd built, and she understood the difference clearly enough to stay out of the way of it. On day 78, 4 days before the final examination, something happened that nobody had planned for. Lieutenant Park, one of the 4 women in the cohort, quiet in a way that was not shyness but focus. Someone who had come into the program as a strong shooter at standard ranges and had developed into something considerably more at extended distance, came to Riley's quarters at 1900 and knocked. Riley opened the door. Park was in civilian clothes, off duty, which meant this wasn't an official conversation, which meant it was something else. "Can I ask you something?" Park said. Riley stepped back. Park came in. She sat in the chair that Holloway had sat in 6 weeks ago, and the echo of that was not lost on Riley. "When you shot at Yuma," Park said, "before you took the shot, what were you thinking about?" Riley looked at her. It was a genuine question, and it deserved a genuine answer. "My father," she said. "I was thinking about the first time he took me to the desert. I was 12. He had a rifle and a folding chair and a thermos of coffee, and he wasn't going to let me shoot that day. Just watch." He pointed at the air above the ground between us and the target, and he said, "The target is the easy part. Everything between here and there, that's what you have to understand." She paused. I was thinking about that, about what he meant, and how long it took me to fully understand it. Park was quiet for a moment. "My mother thinks I'm crazy," she said. "Being here, doing this, she wanted me to be a doctor." She paused. "She doesn't understand why I need to be the best at something this specific." "Do you understand?" Riley said. Park looked at her hands. "I think I need to prove something," she said. "Not to her, to whatever it is inside me that says I might not be able to do this." She paused. "I need to shut that voice up." Riley looked at her steadily. "That voice doesn't go away," she said. "It gets quieter. It gets easier to work around, but it doesn't disappear." She paused. "The shot at Yuma didn't silence it. It just gave me better evidence to argue with it." Park looked at her. Something in her face shifted, a small, careful opening of something that had been held. "I'm going to make the 5 hits," Park said. "I know you are," Riley said. Park stood up. She moved toward the door. She stopped. "Does it bother you?" Park said that it took this long, that your father's work sat in a filing cabinet for 12 years before anyone. "Yes," Riley said simply and immediately. Park nodded. That was enough. She left. Riley sat in the quiet of her quarters for a while. She picked up her notebook. She did not write anything. She just held it the way you hold something that has been with you through enough things to have acquired a weight that isn't in the object itself. Then she set it down and went to bed. The final examination was on a Friday. The 6 NATO observers arrived the evening before and were briefed by Hale on the parameters. They were professional and attentive and asked good questions and were collectively the kind of audience that Riley's methodology had been waiting for, without knowing it was waiting people from 6 different military traditions with 6 different sets of assumptions about what long-range precision looked like and what was achievable, all of them carrying a standard they had arrived with and were about to have adjusted. Riley slept 4 hours the night before. She woke at 0430. She went to the range alone and stood in the dark before anyone else arrived and felt the air on her skin and listened to the conditions, the way her father had taught her to listen, before she touched a rifle, before she made any calculations, before she decided anything, just listening, just receiving with no agenda, except to know what was there. The wind was variable but readable. The temperature gradient was stable. The mirage she knew would run cycles of approximately 8 minutes once the sun got high enough. She would tell the cohort. She always told them what she saw because teaching was not withholding the answer, it was showing the work. The cohort assembled at 0600. 20 students in line, quite the kind of quiet that is not absence of sound but presence of focus. The NATO observers positioned themselves at the observation points. Hale stood at the edge of the range with his arms at his sides, which was as close as a man like Hale came to nervous. Riley stood at the front. She looked at 20 people who had arrived on this range 8 weeks ago with everything they knew and had been willing painstakingly and not without cost to rebuild what they knew into something better. She thought about what her father's methodology had cost him: years of solitary documentation mailed to strangers filed in cabinets, dismissed by institutions that were not yet ready to receive it. She thought about what it had cost her: the crossed-off roster, the supplementary designation, the 19 days of defense documents in midnight writing, and a review board hovering over a confirmed hit like a threat. She thought about Maddox somewhere in Arizona right now, who had filed the withdrawal and sent the co-author agreement in whose name was going to appear on a publication that would carry Thomas Voss's methodology into the permanent record of the field, which was the kind of justice that is imperfect and late and real. Final examination, she said. Her voice was steady. You know the parameters: 5 consecutive hits at 3,500 meters. You call your own holds. You build your own solutions. Nobody does this for you. She looked down the line at each face and let her eyes stay on each face long enough to communicate what she meant. Everything I've shown you over 12 weeks comes from one idea. The idea that everything between you and what you're aiming for is something you can understand if you're willing to look at it long enough. She paused. Look at it, all of it, everything between here and there. She stepped back. Begin. The first shooter took position. The range went quiet. The first hit came at 0623. Marks as expected, methodical patient, completely in his body, in his process, 5 shots over 22 minutes, 5 rings of steel at 3,500 meters, each one clean, and documented and witnessed by observers from 6 countries who wrote in their own notebooks things Riley could not read from where she stood, but could infer from the way their pens moved quickly, which meant something significant was happening. Holloway went second. He took longer than Mark's 31 minutes for 5 shots because Holloway shot with the patience of a man who has genuinely made peace with time rather than the patience of a man performing peace. 5 hits, 5 consecutive. He stood up and looked at Riley and said nothing, and she said nothing, and the nothing between them was full of everything the program had been. Park shot fourth. She settled into position, and she did not look at the observers, and she did not look at Riley, and she built her solution from current data, and she watched the mirage with the focused attention of someone who has internalized a methodology completely enough that it no longer feels like a technique, but like a sense, a new way of perceiving the space between herself and what she's looking at. She fired her first shot at 0718. Hit. Second at 0726. Hit. Third at 0735. Hit. Fourth at 0741 after a longer wait than the others because the wind shifted and she recalculated without rushing, which was the hardest thing the program had asked anyone to do, and which she did cleanly. Hit. Fifth at 0749. Hit. 5 consecutive. She stood up. She looked at the sky for a moment, which was a private gesture, something not performed for the room. Then she looked at Riley. The voice, she said quietly. Still there, Riley said. Yes, Park said. Quieter. Good, Riley said. Keep arguing with it. By 1417 of the 20 students had completed 5 consecutive hits at 3,500 meters. 17, the pass threshold was 15. 85% of the cohort had met the standard that 12 weeks ago none of them could have met. The 3 who hadn't hit the threshold had each landed 4 or 5, not a failure of technique, but of timing of the specific patience that was the last thing to develop and the most important, and which would come with another cycle if they returned. The lead NATO observer, a Belgian colonel named Vandermeer, who had been in precision marksmanship training for 20 years and who had watched the morning session with the specific attention of a man who arrived skeptical and was recalibrating in real time, walked to Riley at 14:15. He had his notebook open. He had numbers in it. 17 of 20, he said. Yes, she said. 85% hit rate at 3,500 meters, he said. Under field conditions, self-directed solutions. Yes, he looked at his notebook. He looked at the range. He looked at Riley. My program in Brussels, he said, has been running precision marksmanship instruction for 11 years. Our hit rate at this distance, under field conditions, is 9%. He paused, and the pause was significant, a man giving a number the weight it deserved. 9%. Riley said nothing. We want the curriculum, Vandermeer said. Not a summary, not an overview. The full methodology, the instruction framework, the assessment protocol. Everything. He paused again. And if you're available to consult on the implementation, we would be very interested in that conversation. Riley looked at him. She looked at the range, at the cleared positions, at the range officers logging the final results at Holloway and Marks, sitting together in the shade, writing in their notebooks at Park, standing at the edge of the range, looking out toward the targets, with the expression of someone taking a measurement of something internal. She thought about her father mailing 12 pages to a stranger because he believed the physics was right. She thought about 12 years in a filing cabinet. She thought about a roster with her name crossed out in a single hard stroke. She looked at Vandermeer. Send me the proposal, she said. I'll review it. He nodded. He extended his hand. She shook it. He walked away. Hale appeared at her side. He had heard enough to know what had happened, which with Hale was almost always enough. He stood beside her and looked at the range and said nothing for a moment, which was its own form of eloquence. Brussels, he said finally. Brussels, she said. Your father, he said, would have something to say about that. He would say it was about time, she said. Hale almost laughed. He would have been right. The session closed at 1500. The range was cleared. The observers were escorted to the debrief building. The cohort, her cohort 12 weeks, 20 people. The thing she had built from a crossed-off roster and a confirmed hit and a father's handwritten physics began the business of packing up and moving out with the easy efficiency of people who have been in this place long enough that the mechanics are automatic. Mark stopped beside her on his way to the staging area. He was carrying his rifle case and his notebook was thicker than it had been when he arrived, which was the most accurate measure of what the program had done to him. Day 21, he said. I remember, she said. I almost quit, he said. I told you I couldn't learn it. You told me you didn't have what it took, she said. That's a different thing. He looked at her. What's the difference? Can't learn means the door's closed, she said. Don't have it yet means the door's open. She looked at him. You walk through it. He was quiet for a moment. I'm going to teach this, he said. When I go back to my unit, I'm going to teach what you taught me. She looked at him. She thought about the chain her father to her to this room to wherever these 20 people went next, and wherever they went to, whoever came after them. The knowledge passing forward through the long chain of attention and patience and willingness to rebuild. Good, she said. Document everything. Every session, every miss, every rebuild. Don't just teach the hits, teach the misses. That's where the real instruction lives. He nodded. He picked up his case. He walked toward the staging area. She stood alone on the range. The wind moved. The mirage had flattened in the late afternoon light, the way it does when the surface temperature begins to equalize with the air above it, and the distance to the targets looked clean and clear and honest in a way it rarely does during the heat of the day. She looked at the 3,500-meter mark. She looked at the steel plate, small and still and unapologetically present at that distance. She thought about one shot, 9 seconds in flight, a desert going quiet, a range officer saying hit and meaning it clean, and documented the word that could not be taken back regardless of who filed what form. She thought about everything between here and there, not just the 2 miles of air and physics and atmospheric complexity between a rifle and a steel plate, but everything between Thomas Voss and this moment, every year of work that had traveled an unlikely path through filing cabinets and mail envelopes, and Yuma range reports and review board withdrawals, and finally here to 17 hits at 3,500 meters to a Belgian colonel's notebook, to a journal that was going to publish 12 handwritten pages and give them the name they had always deserved. She opened her notebook one last time. She wrote the date. She wrote the final result. She wrote the atmospheric conditions, the temperature, the wind, the mirage behavior, the way the day had felt from the first moment on the range at 0430 to this moment in the long, clean afternoon light. She wrote one line at the bottom. Everything between here and there. She closed the notebook. She picked up her rifle case. And she walked forward the way she always had, the way her father had taught her, the way she would teach everyone who came after, not toward the target, but through everything between here and there, with her eyes open, with her attention full, with the patient and undefeated certainty that the distance was not the obstacle. The distance was the work, and the work was hers.